They tell you that America has no old ghosts, no bloodlines thick enough to rot from the inside. They say the land is too young, the history too short, the soil too clean. But if you stand in the right hollow, where the trees lean inward and the roads forget their own names, you can feel it, the weight of something unfinished, something buried without ever being understood. This story begins there. Not in a castle, not in a dynasty, but in a quiet pocket of Appalachia where time slowed down and never quite started again. And long before cameras arrived, before the whispers reached the internet, this land was already keeping its secret. Families here lived close, not just in distance, but in blood. Generations overlapped like shadows at dusk. Marriages were fewer, choices were narrower. And when the world beyond the hills moved forward, industries rising, wars ending, cities growing, this place stayed folded in on itself. It wasn't evil. It wasn't planned. It was isolation doing what isolation has always done. And the Whittaker name didn't echo beyond the county line for most of its existence. It was a name written in census margins, church records, and land deeds that never changed hands. Children were born, grew old, and were buried within walking distance of where they first cried. Schools were far, doctors were farther. And over time, the family tree stopped branching and began looping back on itself, quietly, invisibly, like roots tangling underground. And no one sat down and decided this legacy. That's the most uncomfortable part. There was no villain twirling a mustache. No moment where someone said, "This will end badly." There was only poverty, geography, and the slow erosion of options. When your world is small enough, familiarity becomes destiny. The people you know are the people you marry. The blood you carry is the blood you pass on. And generation by generation, the margin for escape narrows. And by the time outsiders noticed, the damage had already written itself into bone and behavior. Speech patterns altered, learning slowed, emotional development froze at strange intersections of childhood and age. What looked shocking to the modern eye was, to them, simply life as it had always been. They didn't know they were an anomaly. They didn't know they were becoming a symbol. They only knew the routines: wake, eat, wander, return. Days stacked on days, without narrative, without future. And what makes this story unsettling isn't just genetics, it's memory, or rather the absence of it. Trauma usually leaves fingerprints, stories passed down, warnings whispered to children. Here, the trauma became so old it lost its voice. When a family repeats itself long enough, the origin disappears. No one remembers why things are the way they are. They only know that change feels dangerous, foreign, wrong, and the land itself reinforced this forgetting. Appalachia doesn't give itself easily. Roads curve instead of cutting through. Hills block signals, isolate communities, swallow sound. In winter, snow seals people in. In summer, humidity presses down like a held breath. It's a place where survival once depended on sticking together, trusting only your own. That instinct, once protective, became a trap, and there were moments, always moments, when the outside world brushed close. A census worker, a welfare check, a curious neighbor. Each time the family receded further inward, not out of malice, but fear. Fear of being judged, fear of being taken away, fear of a world that spoke too fast and asked too many questions. Silence became their shield, and over time their prison. And when the story finally surfaced, it was framed as spectacle. Headlines reduced lives to a single word. Viewers stared, shocked, repulsed, fascinated. But none of that explains how it happened. None of that answers the real question buried beneath the shock: how many other legacies like this never get discovered? How many are still dissolving quietly, protected by distance and indifference? And this is not a story about monsters. It's a story about what happens when history forgets people long enough for biology to remember. It's about a nation that prides itself on movement and opportunity, and the places it leaves behind when progress chooses a different route. The Whittaker legacy didn't explode into existence. It sank slowly, layer by layer, and by the time anyone noticed the ground had shifted, it was already too deep to pull out cleanly. And because some secrets aren't buried to be hidden, they're buried because no one knows how to face them. And when you try to trace a legacy like this, you quickly learn that records tell you less than silence does. Paper shows dates and names, but it never explains why a family stopped moving forward. To understand that, you have to listen to what isn't said. You have to read between the gaps where schools never followed up, where doctors never returned, where neighbors learned to look away. And in the early generations, nothing appeared unusual. Children were born thin but healthy enough. Adults worked when work existed and survived when it didn't. The isolation was shared by many families across the region. What separated this one was not cruelty or intent, but repetition. The same surnames appearing again and again. The same households listed as both parents' and grandparents' homes. A slow folding inward that no official ever stopped long enough to question. And as decades passed, subtle changes appeared. Language grew simpler, not because intelligence vanished overnight, but because stimulation did. Words are tools, and tools rust when they aren't used. Education requires consistency, and consistency requires access. When schools are miles away and winter cuts roads into silence, learning becomes optional. And when learning becomes optional for long enough, it becomes foreign. And children grew into adults who never fully crossed that invisible line into independence. Emotional growth stalled, curiosity dulled. Not from lack of humanity, but from lack of opportunity. When every day looks like the last, the mind adapts by shrinking its expectations. Dreams require examples. Without them, survival becomes the only ambition, and the genetic effects crept in quietly. No alarms sounded. No doctor stood at the edge of the property with a clipboard and a warning. Physical traits repeated themselves with increasing intensity. Developmental delays became normalized. What might have been a red flag elsewhere became background noise here. When everyone you know shares the same limitations, limitation stops looking like a problem, and the family didn't see themselves as broken. That idea came later, imported from outside eyes. Inside the hollow, they were simply themselves. They laughed when they were happy. They fought when they were frustrated. They mourned their dead in ways that felt appropriate to them. The danger of this kind of legacy isn't that people suffer consciously, it's that suffering becomes invisible when it's all you've ever known. And there's a particular cruelty in generational harm that operates without intent. No single person can be blamed. No clear moment marks the point of no return. Each generation inherits conditions slightly worse than the last, until the weight becomes unmistakable. By then, it's no longer a personal issue, it's structural, biological, cultural, locked in place by time. And outsiders often ask why no one intervened sooner. It's an easy question when asked from a distance. But intervention requires awareness, and awareness requires proximity. These families lived just far enough away to be ignored, just close enough to be counted. Welfare systems weren't built for places that hid so well, and communities, bound by unspoken rules, rarely turn on their own, and even when help arrived, it often came with fear attached. Government cars, clipboards, questions that felt like accusations. For families who had survived by staying invisible, attention felt like threat, so they withdrew further, reinforcing the cycle. Help offered too late and without trust can do more harm than good. And as the years rolled forward, the gap between this family and the modern world widened. Technology leapt ahead. Social norms shifted, expectations changed, but inside that pocket of land, time remained suspended. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't resistance. It was simply inertia, life continuing the way it always had because no alternative had ever been made real. And what we're really witnessing here is not a freak occurrence, but a case study in neglect stretched across generations. When society fails quietly enough, the consequences don't look dramatic at first. They look small, unimportant, easy to ignore, until one day the accumulation becomes impossible to deny. And by the time cameras found their way down those roads, the legacy was already complete. Not finished, just fully formed. The family had become a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths about isolation, poverty, and the cost of forgetting entire communities. And once that mirror was lifted into public view, there was no way to look without feeling unsettled. And because the horror here isn't sudden, it's slow, patient, built layer by layer, while the rest of the world wasn't paying attention. And there's a moment in every buried story when the past stops feeling distant and starts feeling personal. When you realize this wasn't ancient history, not something sealed off by centuries, but a process still warm to the touch. The Whittaker legacy didn't end when the 20th century began, it followed it. It watched the world change from a distance and stayed exactly where it was. And as roads improved elsewhere, these roads remained thin and broken. As hospitals modernized, medical care here stayed sporadic, reactive, and rare. Births happened without oversight. Illnesses passed without names. When something went wrong, it was absorbed into daily life rather than treated. Pain became routine. Difference became invisible. The line between what could be helped and what simply was began to blur, and inside the family, roles never evolve. Adults depended on caretakers who themselves had never learned how to care beyond imitation. Authority existed without understanding. Rules existed without explanation. Children grew up watching behaviors rather than being taught reasons. And without reasons, there is no framework for change, only repetition. And what's unsettling is how stable the system became. Not healthy, stable. Like a building with a cracked foundation that hasn't collapsed yet. Everything held just enough to keep going. Meals were eaten. Fires were lit. Days passed. And because nothing visibly broke, there was no urgency to fix what was quietly failing underneath. And psychologists often talk about learned helplessness, the state where individuals stop trying because experience has taught them that effort changes nothing. In families like this, that condition doesn't just affect individuals. It becomes generational. Children don't learn hope because they never see it rewarded. Curiosity fades because curiosity leads nowhere. The world shrinks until it fits neatly inside what is known, and when outsiders finally began to pay attention, they often misunderstood what they were seeing. They expected fear or shame or awareness of abnormality. Instead, they encountered neutrality, flatness, lives lived without comparison. The absence of reference points made judgment meaningless. You can't feel different if you've never seen different. And that's where the discomfort deepens. Because it forces a question most people don't want to ask: how much of identity is choice, and how much is environment? If a person is never shown another way to live, are they responsible for not seeking it? Or is responsibility something that only exists when options are visible? And the Whittakers didn't barricade themselves against the world. The world simply never pushed hard enough to get in. Institutions designed to protect vulnerable populations rely on reporting, follow-ups, thresholds. But when neglect is quiet and continuous rather than explosive, it slips through every crack. No single incident triggered intervention. There was only accumulation, and systems are notoriously bad at responding to slow damage. And by the time attention arrived, it came wrapped in judgment. Cameras didn't come to understand. They came to document, to capture, to label. And once labeled, the family became frozen in public imagination, stripped of context and reduced to a condition. Their humanity flattened into a headline. And what the footage didn't show was the long lead up, the decades of absence, the missed chances, the moments where a slightly different choice by a school board, a health worker, a county official, might have nudged the trajectory just enough to change everything. Not dramatically, not instantly, but enough. And instead, the legacy continued, self-reinforcing. Care responsibilities fell on those least equipped to carry them. Frustration expressed itself in confusion rather than anger. Emotional bonds existed, but they were tangled, undefined. Love, when it appeared, was raw and unfiltered, lacking the structure most people rely on to make sense of it. And then still, life went on. That's the part that lingers. This wasn't a horror movie with screams and sudden violence. It was quieter than that. It was people sitting in rooms, staring at walls, existing without narrative. It was birthdays that passed without meaning, losses that registered as absence rather than grief, a lineage slowly dissolving, not with a bang, but with a long, steady exhale. And to witness that kind of erosion is unsettling because it feels preventable, and prevention implies responsibility. It suggests that this wasn't fate or curse or inevitability, but the result of choices made far away by people who never knew the names of those affected. And the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes this story isn't just about one family. It's about the blind spots we accept as normal, the places we don't visit, the lives we don't track, and the cost of assuming that silence means stability. And by the time the story reached public ears, it arrived already distorted. What people saw felt sudden, shocking, almost unreal, as if this family had emerged fully formed from nowhere. But legacies like this don't appear overnight. They ferment. They deepen in darkness, undisturbed, until exposure feels obscene, like opening a sealed grave. And when attention finally came, it came without patience. The modern world has little tolerance for slow explanations. It prefers spectacle. It prefers a single word that can carry an entire narrative on its back. And once that word was attached, the family ceased to be seen as people shaped by circumstance. They became symbols, warnings, curiosities, objects of morbid fascination. And this is where the damage took a new form. Public exposure didn't reverse the legacy, it froze it. The moment cameras arrived, the family's story stopped evolving in the public mind. Whatever complexity existed before was flattened into something easily consumed and quickly judged. Context vanished, compassion became optional, but inside that exposure was another truth, one far more uncomfortable than the images themselves. The fact that this family existed at all meant the systems designed to protect the vulnerable had failed repeatedly, quietly, and without consequence. It wasn't one failure, it was a chain of them, each small enough to be excused, each insignificant on its own, together catastrophic. And think about how many checkpoints exist in a modern society: schools, clinics, social services, census offices, courts. Each one a place where someone could have paused long enough to ask a deeper question. But questions slow things down. And slowing down costs time, money, attention. It's easier to mark a box, file a report, and move on. And the family became experts in being overlooked, not by strategy but by necessity. Visibility had never brought help, only confusion, disruption, fear. So silence became adaptive. Silence kept things predictable, and predictability, even when it's painful, often feels safer than change. And inside the household, patterns hardened. Habits replaced guidance. Care became mechanical, stripped of foresight. No one was planning years ahead, because years ahead had never mattered. When the present demands all available energy, the future becomes theoretical, optional, abstract, and the human mind adjusts to whatever environment it's placed in. That adaptability is one of our greatest strengths, and in cases like this, one of our greatest vulnerabilities. When dysfunction persists long enough, the mind stops labeling it as such. It becomes the baseline, the default setting, and once something becomes baseline, it stops generating alarm. And what unsettles observers most is not just what happened, but how normal it felt to those living inside it. There was no collective panic, no moment of reckoning, just continuity. A life passed down the way worn furniture is passed down, used, familiar, unquestioned. And here's the truth that lingers beneath every uncomfortable reaction. Many people want this story to be exceptional because that makes it easier to dismiss. If it's rare, it's unfortunate but ignorable. If it's unique, it doesn't demand reflection. But it isn't unique. It's just visible, and there are other pockets like this, maybe not identical but rhyming. Communities where isolation has outpaced intervention, where neglect has learned to hide behind normalcy, where generational harm doesn't announce itself loudly enough to trigger response. And what makes this legacy disturbing isn't just biology, it's what it reveals about priorities, about who gets followed up on and who gets written off, about how easily a society can accept slow decay as long as it happens out of sight. And then once you see that, the story changes. It stops being about a single family and starts being about a collective blind spot, a shared responsibility diffused so widely that no one feels accountable. The kind of harm that doesn't come from hatred but from absence. And the land didn't curse them. The blood didn't choose itself. The legacy wasn't inevitable. It was built, quietly, by years of indifference layered one on top of another, until removal became impossible without causing more damage. And that's what makes this story linger. Not because it's grotesque, but because it feels uncomfortably plausible. Because it forces a realization most people would rather avoid. Sometimes the most disturbing truths aren't hidden by secrecy, but by familiarity. And by the time you reach the middle of a story like this, something changes inside the listener. Curiosity gives way to unease. The shock wears off, replaced by a heavier question: what does it mean to witness damage that can't be undone? Not repaired, not corrected, only managed, documented, and remembered. This is where the legacy stops being historical and starts feeling moral. And what people often miss is that exposure doesn't heal. Attention doesn't reverse time. Once a lineage has folded in on itself for long enough, the effects don't disappear just because they're acknowledged. The body remembers. The mind remembers. Even when help arrives, it arrives late, carrying the weight of everything that came before it. And care workers who entered this world faced an impossible task. How do you introduce structure to lives that have never relied on it? How do you teach independence to people who were never shown what independence looks like? The gap wasn't just educational, it was existential. Basic concepts others take for granted felt abstract here. Planning, consequences, choice. These ideas require a foundation that had eroded decades earlier. And so intervention became maintenance rather than transformation. Stabilize, contain, reduce harm. The goal quietly shifted from progress to preservation, not because anyone admitted defeat, but because reality made the limits clear. You can't untangle generations overnight. You can't rewind development. You can only work with what remains. And that truth makes many uncomfortable because it challenges a deeply held belief that awareness automatically leads to improvement. It doesn't. Awareness without infrastructure is just observation, and observation without responsibility is voyeurism. This is where the line between concern and consumption begins to blur, and public reaction followed a predictable arc. Initial outrage, then fascination, then fatigue. Stories like this burn bright and fast in the public eye before being replaced by the next disturbing revelation. But the people inside the story don't get to move on. Their lives continue long after the audience scrolls away, and there's a quiet cruelty in that imbalance. The world takes what it wants, a sense of shock, a moral thrill, a reminder that things could be worse, and leaves the consequences behind. No long-term commitment, no sustained attention, just a brief spotlight, then darkness again. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? And that question lingers because it refuses to stay hypothetical. It forces the viewer to imagine responsibility not as an abstract concept, but as something inherited, something unavoidable. If you were born into this legacy, with no roadmap and no outside reference, how would you know what needed to change? And more importantly, would you even believe change was possible? And generational trauma doesn't announce itself as trauma. It feels like routine. It feels like the way things are. That's why breaking it requires more than awareness. It requires sustained, patient disruption. The kind that systems rarely provide, because systems are designed for efficiency, not endurance. And what happened here exposes a weakness in how society defines success. We celebrate escape stories, individuals who claw their way out of hardship. But we struggle to address situations where escape was never presented as an option. where survival itself consumed every available resource, where there was no energy left to imagine something else, and the legacy continued not because no one cared, but because care was inconsistent, fragmented, and temporary. Each attempt to help was isolated, disconnected from the last. Without continuity, nothing took root. Without trust, nothing held. And so the story settles into something heavier than outrage. It becomes a quiet indictment of how easily we mistake visibility for solution, how quickly we absolve ourselves once something is named, how readily we move on believing acknowledgement is the same as action, and the most disturbing part isn't what the cameras captured. It's what they couldn't, the years before, the years after, the slow grind of life continuing without resolution, a legacy exposed but not erased, and that leaves us with an uncomfortable realization: some histories don't end. They just change form. They shift from private suffering to public knowledge, carrying the same weight in a different shape. And this isn't the center of the story because it offers answers. It's the center because it removes excuses. Once you see the pattern clearly, you can't pretend it's an accident. You can't dismiss it as a curiosity. You have to sit with the truth that this kind of harm thrives in silence and survives attention just as easily. And by this point in the story, the question is no longer how it happened. That question has been answered in fragments, stitched together from neglect, isolation, and time. The question now is why it stays with us. Why a legacy like this refuses to settle into the past, even after it's been exposed, analyzed, and archived. And the answer lies in discomfort. This story doesn't allow distance. It resists the comfort of saying, that was then, or that was them. It presses too close to the present, too close to systems that still operate the same way, too close to communities that remain just out of reach, too close to the idea that progress is uneven, selective, and often indifferent. And what lingers is the realization that the Whittaker legacy is not an anomaly of blood, but a symptom of neglect stretched across time. Genetics didn't act alone. They were guided, shaped, and reinforced by social absence. Remove the isolation early enough, and the biology might have softened. Remove the neglect early enough, and the trajectory might have bent. But early enough passed quietly year by year, while attention was elsewhere. And this is where the story turns inward on the listener. Because once you understand that no single decision created this outcome, it becomes harder to point blame outward. There's no villain to condemn, no singular moment to correct. There's only a chain of small omissions, missed follow-ups, underfunded programs, communities deemed too remote to prioritize, and that chain still exists. And there are places right now where children are growing up without adequate education, without healthcare, without exposure to alternatives. Places where family lines are shrinking inward not by intent, but by constraint, where isolation is treated as culture instead of warning. The names may be different, the accents may change, but the pattern remains recognizable. And what frightens people most about this story is not the physical reality, it's the moral one. The idea that a society can look directly at slow, generational harm and still struggle to respond meaningfully. That we are far better at reacting to crises than preventing them. That suffering which unfolds quietly is easier to tolerate than suffering that demands immediate attention. And the Whittakers became known only after the damage had fully matured. By then, intervention was limited to care, not correction. And care, while necessary, does not rewrite history. It only softens the present. That leaves a residue of helplessness, an awareness that some harm, once done, can never be undone. And this is where the story settles into something heavier than horror. It becomes a warning without drama, a reminder that the most dangerous legacies are the ones built slowly, without spectacle, the ones no one notices until they're complete. And maybe that's why this story feels forbidden. Not because it was hidden deliberately, but because acknowledging it forces uncomfortable reflection. It asks whether we are willing to look for these patterns before they harden, whether we are willing to invest in prevention rather than documentation, whether we value lives that don't announce their suffering loudly enough. And there's a temptation to close the book here, to say the story has been told, the lesson learned. But stories like this don't end with understanding, they end with choice. And choice is where responsibility lies. And do we continue to treat these legacies as curiosities, things to observe, discuss, and then set aside? Or do we recognize them as evidence of a deeper flaw in how attention, care, and value are distributed? Because once you accept the latter, neutrality is no longer an option. And the most unsettling truth is that nothing about this outcome required malice. Indifference was enough. Distance was enough. Time was enough. And those forces are still at work, shaping lives far from cameras and headlines. And so when this story follows you after the screen goes dark, that's not an accident. It's because it doesn't belong solely to the past. It belongs to the present moment, asking whether anything has truly changed, or whether we've simply become better at not looking. And the legacy buried here isn't just genetic, it's institutional, cultural, human. And until those layers are confronted with the same seriousness as the spectacle they produce, new versions of this story will continue to form, quietly, in places no one thinks to check. And there's a final weight that settles over a story like this once everything has been said that can be said. Not closure, not relief, something heavier. The understanding that knowing is not the same as resolving, and that some legacies do not end, they echo. And what remains after the facts fade is the silence that made them possible. The quiet stretches of land where no one asks questions because questions feel intrusive. The policies written far away, assuming access that doesn't exist. The belief that progress is automatic, that time itself fixes what neglect breaks. This legacy dismantles that illusion completely. And the Whittaker story forces us to confront a truth most societies avoid: not all suffering is loud enough to demand action. Some of it survives precisely because it adapts to being ignored. It becomes ordinary, acceptable, invisible. And once that happens, damage no longer looks like damage. It looks like tradition or lifestyle, or just the way things are. And this is how legacies like this outlive outrage. Attention comes and goes, empathy spikes and fades, but the underlying conditions remain unless something structural changes. And structure is slow, it's unglamorous. It doesn't fit neatly into headlines or documentaries. It requires patience, funding, follow-through, things far harder to sustain than curiosity. And there's a temptation to frame this story as a warning from the past, to say, look what happened back then, and move on. But that framing is comforting precisely because it's false. This isn't a relic, it's a pattern. One that repeats wherever isolation outpaces care, wherever poverty narrows choice, wherever silence is mistaken for stability. And what haunts this legacy is not just what it became, but how avoidable it feels in hindsight. Hindsight, of course, is merciless. It shows every misturn clearly, every moment where intervention might have shifted the outcome. But hindsight also exposes something more troubling: how often those moments still occur unnoticed in the present. And the family at the center of this story didn't ask to become an example. They didn't consent to represent anything larger than themselves. And yet, their existence now carries a burden far heavier than any individual life should bear. They've become a symbol, not of moral failure, but of collective neglect, and symbols are dangerous when they replace responsibility. It's easy to point at a story like this and feel shock, pity, even outrage. It's much harder to ask what systems allowed it to happen and whether those systems have truly changed. Harder still to admit that similar conditions exist today, wearing different names, hiding behind different geographies. And the real horror isn't found in the images or descriptions people fixate on. It's found in the realization that this story did not require cruelty to unfold, only absence, only delay, only the slow accumulation of later, until later became never. And when the land finally gives up a secret like this, it's not asking to be judged. It's asking to be understood. And understanding carries obligation. It means you don't get to unsee the pattern once you recognize it. It means you can't pretend isolation is harmless, or that time alone heals generational wounds. And this is where the story ends, not with answers, but with awareness sharpened into discomfort. A discomfort meant to linger, meant to follow you beyond the screen. Because stories like this only matter if they change how we look at the quiet places, the forgotten ones, the communities that don't demand attention loudly enough to receive it. And the most inbred legacy buried with the Whittakers is not just written in bloodlines or records. It's written in gaps between institutions and people, between policy and practice, between what we notice and what we choose to ignore. And as long as those gaps remain, the ground will keep absorbing stories like this, slowly, patiently, waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions before the damage becomes irreversible again.